Hi, my name's Heidi Bernhardt. I'm the President and Executive Director for CADDAC, which stands for Centre for ADHD Awareness Canada. We are a national not-for-profit organization that takes leadership in awareness, education, and advocacy for ADHD. That's CADDAC. I've Dr. Murray, who heads the ADHD clinic at Children's Hospital, has been very instrumental in helping us organize this conference and these sessions. And she has just told me I need to, before I do anything else, actually announce this to everybody because she's hugely excited about it. On Thursday late afternoon, we met with a representative from the Department of Special Education for the Ministry of Education in BC, and we've been informed that they are rewriting the guidelines for special education in BC, and that ADHD will now be recognized and is written into the category, I believe it's Q, where learning disabilities are under. We knew they were working on it because we met with them 2 years ago, actually for our last conference here, and we've been in touch back and forth, and they kept saying, yes, something's coming, something's coming. So apparently it's supposed to be out in the new year. And when it does come out, we will do a national media release congratulating the Ministry of Education of BC, and then we will use that to shame some of the other provinces we're still working on. So that's hugely exciting news. We've also been in BC for the last 2 years meeting with various other ministries. Health, we're doing some advocacy with Ministry of Health now, and there will be hopefully something to announce on that front in the next month or two as well, but I can't share that with you right now. And we've met with various other ministries, Ministry of Justice and Corrections. This fall we put out a paper on ADHD in the justice system that was sent to ministries right across Canada, as well as law societies, etc. If any of you are interested in any of our advocacy efforts, papers, last year we wrote a paper with Dr. Tannick's help on ADHD in the post-secondary system that is accessible on our website as well. And the gist of the paper was that post-secondary institutions should not be requesting psychoeducational assessments be done for students with ADHD to qualify for accommodations. And there we've gotten word that there's been some significant change across the country. If you have somebody who is going into post-secondary, please, all that information is on the website, access it there, or feel free to contact us. So just a little bit of housekeeping work. We were notified actually as I was pulling up with a cab to my hotel Thursday that the venue has some issues with flooding. I have been told that people in Vancouver are very used to troubles with construction and flooding in your businesses. So I am told you'll be used to this. So anyway, so we've had to reshuffle some of the sessions. So the session, what is called session 1, that was supposed to be in the room right across the hall here, we have now set up in the lunchroom. So it will be a little cozy, but anyway, set up there. And for session 2, because of the security and the locked doors, you actually have to go down the hall, up the stairs and around, but there's pink signs everywhere that will show you how to get there as well. If any of you want Wi-Fi, you can access just the UBC Wi-Fi. It's UBC Visitor. And apparently the password is any legitimate email. So any email address you can put in as a password, and you'll be able to access Wi-Fi. All right, during the day, I'll be speaking to you at various different times about announcements for different things we have coming up in Vancouver next year, and some other things CADDAC is doing as well as membership. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Rosemary TANNOCK. So Dr. TANNOCK is Professor Emerita of U of T. She remains a senior scientist at CADDAC. I say she remains because she keeps trying to quit, but they won't let her. So Rosemary and I have known each other for quite a number of years. When I say she's a renowned world researcher in ADHD, I can truly verify that, because every time I try to track Rosemary down, she is in one country or another when we email back and forth. So Rosemary is traveling the world talking about ADHD and learning, as well as learning disabilities. She is a wealth of knowledge. She's also the past Canada Research Chair in Special Education at OISE. So her knowledge of ADHD and learning, as I said, is phenomenal. So everyone help me welcome Dr. Rosemary TANNOCK.
So thank you, Heidi, for the invitation. Thank you to you and CADDAC for the invitation. And a special thank you to all of you for taking time to come here on a Saturday. That's, I think, a very special thing to do. I'm curious, you've just heard a lot about me. I'm traveling around the place, which is fun. But I'd like to know who you all are. Just by show of hands, who of you are educators or school psychologists working primarily in the school systems? Okay, great. Who of you are in more like counseling or social work, maybe outside services? Yep, great. Individuals, also parents of youngsters with ADHD or individuals with ADHD themselves? Yep, okay, great. So we have a whole admixture. Super, thank you. So what my plan is, let me just first do disclosures. As a member of the University and Hospital for Sick Children, we are required always to indicate any potential conflicts of interest for this talk. So I think two things are particularly relevant here, that I was a member of this DSM-5. The DSM-5, for those of you who don't know, is really what we call the Bible of psychiatry. So it's a manual for physicians, psychiatrists, physicians, psychologists that give the specific criteria and guidelines for diagnosis for all mental health disorders. So I was appointed for the group working on ADHD and externalizing disorders. And then because I was puzzled why nobody seemed to be mentioning learning disabilities or language impairments, I kept bothering them. So, what happened was I was cross-appointed then to that committee too. That was a completely volunteer position that went on for 7 years' work. No pay for that particular work. With Heidi, we're both members of the World Health Organization, where they're really working to develop a clinical tool for understanding two things: the strengths and the challenges associated with ADHD, and the challenges being more the impairments. And this is an international group that is trying to develop these guidelines. Have some very small conflicts of interest with grants. Was funded by a particular company that does cognitive working memory training, and they provide software licenses for free. And Purdue Pharma allowed one of my students to join a clinical trial. Otherwise, it's just really very small talks that they give me honorarium. Okay, so my plan today is because I had a hunch that it would be a fairly mixed audience with a lot of expertise within the audience, but also perhaps different stages of knowledge. So I was going to start with what is ADHD, and if you're struggling to still understand what is ADHD, you're not alone. This struggle has been going on for a long, long time. So I'll just do a synopsis of the history and then focus on the issues of what I call things to keep in mind about the manifestations of ADHD, and just a few slides of the relevant aspects of neurobiology. And that's what I'm going to show you, is so that we'll have a basis for then moving on to understand why individuals with ADHD in general will have problems with learning and academic functioning. Not all, but in general. And so we're trying to understand both the strengths and challenges within a school system. Importantly, I will not be addressing intervention, because this, my colleague Penny Corkum, will be addressing this afternoon, I think is correct. So I won't be taking questions about intervention, so keep those. I'm sure you'll have many, but keep those for Penny, please. Thank you. So I'm going to start with just saying, what is your probing your current understanding of what ADHD is? I call that a concept, an idea, a mental representation. And what we end up finding often in all the field of mental health disorders within psychology is only too often what we think is our mental representation is actually a measurement. So we end up reifying a measurement rather than the idea of an entity. Let me give you an example. So often we'll have a circular argument. Well, somebody has a learning disability. Why? Well, they've got a gap between their ability and the actual achievement. But that's a measurement. That's not a mental representation of what it is. So this is the kind of circular thinking we often get into. If you ask any physician, what is the concept of cancer? It doesn't matter whether we're talking about like a tumor, a solid tumor, or one of their leukemias, for example. But doctors will tell you, well, cancer is an abnormal growth of cells which tend to proliferate in an uncontrolled way, and in some cases will spread to other parts of the body. That's what I call the basic concept. So thinking about that, just take a minute to think about, and preferably just make a note if you've got a pencil or a pen, to say, what is your own concept of ADHD? So don't flip ahead and scramble through the handouts. Just think, what is your own? If I was to ask individually, each one of you, what is your concept, your mental idea of ADHD? Just write it down. And the reason I'm asking you to do it, because it will it'll influence how you interact with students or children or spouses with ADHD. And it will interact and influence how you help and support or inadvertently make life more challenging for that individual with ADHD. So just take a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to stop you simply because obviously to go through time, but keep your own words handy as we go through the next set of slides. If you've had a challenge, and often I notice that it takes you quite a while to write all this down, and if you're having a challenge with saying, what is it? Don't worry, this has been going on a long time. So initially, years and years and years ago, centuries ago, the focus was on inattention. And there's this cartoon which I love. It says, my teacher said I don't pay enough attention in class. Well, at least I think that's what she said. But the first mention of ADHD was as early as 1775. This is not a myth of modern society. It's not a cause of all this of television or too much screening, all of these things. But it occurred in the 17th century. And there the major concern was with distractibility and what I call problems in really carrying through ideas. So lots of copious ideas. So I love this. I've listed it as poor self-regulation. Mostly reckless, often copious considering important projects, but inconsistent in their execution. Only hears half of things, memorizes only half of things. So the whole notion was bright in individuals who were bright, but had a particular difficulty with regulating their own attention. Of course, the cause at that time was often poor mums get the blame for everything. So the cause was thought to be poor child rearing. A flaw of inattention develops because of poor parenting, and that results in dull fibres. I love this, because at that point, remember, nobody knew anything about brain circuits and so on, but to do with, it resulted in this dull activity of the fibres, too soft or too agile, and that led to inefficient sensation and perception and inefficient attention. I love the treatment. Isolation, gymnastics, cold baths, horseback riding, etc. Ironically, exercise is becoming back into fashion again now. It's quite intriguing. Also, another physician in Edinburgh, so it was not just a, quote, German idea, but also in Scotland, Alexander Crichton, who ended up developing this whole sort of huge tome about an inquiry into the nature and origin of mental derangement. In book 2, chapter 2, that on attention and its diseases. And it's a lovely kind of note, and you can access this online in many libraries, university libraries, for example. But it says, when born within a person, so they believed it was an inheritable congenital problem, when born within a person, it becomes evident at a very early period of life and has a very bad effect, inasmuch as it renders him incapable of attending with consistency to any one object of education. And he went on to entreat teachers, and in the second, I think it's book 3, entreat teachers to help these youngsters because they can learn, but they might need more help than other kids. So the argument is that it does not influence their ability to learn, but they may need different methods to learn. And that was incredibly advanced insight in those early years. It actually is now supported, this problem of inattention is supported by current data. So this study comes from Quebec. It was a large sort of provincial population. And what this study did was to take youngsters and follow youngsters from age 6 to age 12 in the school system. And they asked teachers at every age, at every grade level, to just complete a very simple, short rating scale. It wasn't a diagnostic scale, but probing the symptoms of inattention and restlessness, but mostly inattention. And then they looked at the follow-up. They followed these youngsters all the way and called them back and tried to ascertain what was going on now when they were 22 and 23. By 22 and 23 years of age, had they managed to graduate from high school? So the top purple line shows you those who had high levels of inattention right through school, despite having different teachers, etc. They all were rating a particular child, or this group of children, as consistently, persistently inattentive in the classroom. That had a drastic, devastating impact on rates of graduation. Only 1/3 of those students graduated high school by the time they were 22, 23. So even allowing for the opportunity to drop out, come back in the system, they did not complete graduation. By contrast, the red line at the bottom, those who were persistently, continually rated by teachers as attentive, without any problems in attention, 88% of those had graduated by the age of 22, 23. And also one would predict that there are youngsters who started out inattentive and then sort of got themselves together. And that's the green line, but it still had an impact, only 64%. Those of who initially were fine weren't inattentive, but gradually over these period of 6 years were suddenly being rated as more and more inattentive in the classroom. Only 50% graduated. So this is highlighting, this is not diagnosis, this is highlighting the devastating effect of this persistent, long-time inattention within a classroom setting. Likewise, again, I always look, when we're looking for evidence or we're looking for findings, I always advise you, don't rely on one study. go to another study because you want to see replication, to have confidence in the finding. So this study is a large-scale study of 6,000 boys and 6,000 girls in the United Kingdom. And they looked at the children's ratings, teachers' ratings of inattention in early school years, and then looked at what happens to their final school exam, which is the GSCE that all children are required to take towards the end of high school. And you could see this downward sloping line. So that basically, and what the analysis showed, that for every single symptom of inattention, so this is not just diagnosis, but it had a devastating effect on the scores by the time they finished school. So you can see for the boys here, the rates of the profiles of these scores on this final exam decreases with every increasing symptom. Girls start at a high point because it's not shown up as much, but the same pattern exists. So the long-term effect of inattention is not good. And that immediately says this is one aspect of youngsters with a diagnosis of ADHD that needs to be really taken seriously, but more than that, it has to be taken seriously in any child, that persistent inattention is a risk factor for poor outcomes. So although the initial, in the 1700s, the focus was on inattention, all of a sudden, as everybody, the clinicians and researchers were struggling to understand what ADHD is, the whole focus suddenly switched to emphasize hyperactivity and non-compliance. So this is where we saw the classic stories by Heinrich Hoffmann. He wrote for his son, but he wrote stories about the children he'd seen in his clinic. And he had this dual conceptualization of ADHD, that it was poorly regulated behavior and non-compliance. That was the fidgety Phil, who couldn't sit still and ended up tipping over his chair and pulling off all the tablecloth and all the meal. But it also refers to Johnny Head in the Air, who had problems with attention and learning. And so it's a sort of poorly regulated attention as well as poorly regulated behavior. This notion was further emphasized by Dr. George Still in 1900, and he actually emphasized even more the non-compliance, as though it was a literally almost like a weakness within the child, and talked about this children who were exhibiting violent outbursts, major temper tantrums, wanton mischievousness, as though it's intentional, destructiveness, and do not respond to punishment. He also described their abnormal incapacity for sustained attention causing school failure, even in the absence of an intellectual problem. So again, you can see some trends persisting, but they keep oscillating. Mental instability in the French literature, a group of, quote, abnormal school children. The language is really quite obnoxious, but they talk about exuberant physical mobility, never staying still, getting up from the table, quickly flipping from one game to another. Intellectual mobility is not reduced, but they do not obey. They have sudden impulses, lots of promising, but instantly do exactly what they said they wouldn't do. So this is a kind of notion again, and it points to perhaps something within the child, that they are being disobedient, willfully, intentionally misbehaving. And that's been a real concern and still persists today as kids get blamed, or the parents get blamed. Again, in Germany, they then continue to emphasize even more so the hyperactivity, marked motor restlessness, running up and down, etc., and displeased when deterred, so emotional outbursts when they're told not to do something. Then as we went into the 1950s to 60s, the concept was expanded. And initially it was thought there was such a wide range of problems that it must reflect minimal brain dysfunction or damage. There was no evidence at that point to support that concept because you couldn't measure things in the brain at that time. And so what happened in reality is all these different professions took bits of this, quote, elephant called ADHD. They stood at one side looking at this elephant of ADHD and said, they've got language problems. And psychologists would say, oh no, wait a minute, it's their intellectual function. Psychiatrists would say, no, wait a minute, it's behavior, or psychologists would say. And so it began to be the sad thing, I think, that persists today with what I call dissolution of the child. So it was not or we failed to consider the breadth of impact of ADHD on a particular individual. So it became a sort of what I call a specialty issue. The speech pathologist might assess a child and see a language problem. That same child, if assessed by somebody else, might see a behavior problem. So again, we have this sort of what I call oscillation of ideas. Then when we started within the mental health system, the DSM, through the 1990s to 2013, ADHD was conceptualized a disruptive behavior disorder that onset in childhood, and that in severe, impairing, developmentally inappropriate levels of inattention, impulsiveness, hyperactivity. So the whole focus was on these observable symptoms without any real consideration of anything else that the child might be struggling with. And based on that, using those criteria and definitions of the DSM at that time, it was estimated it affects about 5% of children worldwide and about 2 to 4% of adults worldwide because it persists across the lifespan in many cases. Then comes the DSM-5. And here was an interesting challenge. We were asked as a committee to say, well, where does ADHD belong? Does it belong as currently classified as a disruptive impulse control problem that's akin to things like conduct disorder, that's really antisocial behavior, really severe behavior problems, stealing, lying, aggressiveness, or non-compliance of the oppositional defiant disorder? Is that what ADHD is? Or is it a neurodevelopmental disorder, somewhat akin to communication problems, learning disabilities, high-functioning autism spectrum? Where does it best fit in terms of the conceptualization? And I can tell you this was the only one decision that was unanimous in the committee. It was clearly defined, clearly best conceptualized as a neurodevelopmental disorder. So this is a huge shift. Often people don't recognize the significance because it's shifting the concept. So ADHD currently is aligned alongside neurodevelopmental disorders. And in part, it absolutely makes sense because the genetics, the brain differences, the cognitive differences are shared so much more closely with other conditions grouped under neurodevelopmental disorders, and they share less with the disorders listed as an impulse control disorder. So what is exactly a neurodevelopmental disorder? Well, it's a group of congenital, meaning from birth or before birth, problems in which the development of this brain, the central nervous system, is disturbed in some way. So these disorders can include developmental brain dysfunction that can manifest as neuropsychiatric problems or impaired motor function, language problems, learning problems, or problems in nonverbal communication. There are two types. One type is where the cause is unknown. So things like Down syndrome, Williams syndrome, that's a kind of known prenatal cause, genetic or acquired. But it also includes this other group where there is no known cause. The cause is believed to be multifactorial, many things, genetic, exposure to environmental issues that kind of combine to result in the manifestation of these neurodevelopmental disorders. If you take that group of problems, this neurodevelopmental problems as a whole, you'll see there's commonalities in the onset in early developmental period. So you'll see signs and symptoms of just altered patterns, sometimes quite subtle, of development compared to their peers. You'll see cognitive deficits and behavioral, they're called deficits, but clear differences behaviorally, cognitively, compared to their peers. You'll see these impairments that you'll see early on tend to persist right across childhood into adulthood. Mostly is more males than females, typically about 3 to 1. 3 males have these neurodevelopmental disorders as to about 1 female. Tend to be familial, run in families, inherited, and genetic origins, but no single biological cause. So many alterations in the genetic makeup and in environmental triggers, such as exposure to various toxins or prematurity or things like that. So the current medical understanding of ADHD is that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder that first appears in preschool years and early childhood years, characteristics of ADHD, and then there's a set of criteria that required at least 6 symptoms of ADHD, inattention, or at least 6 symptoms of hyperactivity that persist for at least 6 months and have occurred in early childhood, i.e. before about age 12. So right now, we're saying, are we actually witnessing a major change in the concept of ADHD? Should we understand that there has been this major shift? And what are the implications of that for that individual with ADHD, the family, teachers, etc.? Because thinking of it as a neurodevelopmental difference is very different to thinking of it as a disruptive behavior disorder that has to be controlled. The focus is on behavior. We're saying, it's actually not correct. You need to focus on the challenges of the differences in development, the neurodevelopment. So it's a big shift in understanding ADHD. So just at the moment, just out of curiosity, I'm not going to ask you specifically, but how many of you, the concept that you held in your head or you wrote down, is it more consistent with a neurodevelopmental problem or more consistent with a disruptive behavior disorder? What about neurodevelopmental problem? Great. Okay, what about a disruptive behavior disorder? And it's obviously not, you would be scared to put your hand up probably, because it is shifting. But yet we all often say ADHD is, problems with inattention, hyperactivity. Well, that's how we measure it. That's why we get into this weird argument that we're confusing how we measure it with how we conceptualize it. Okay, so the next set of questions, or issues I'm going to cover, is what I call things to keep in mind as we go forward, things about ADHD that you may or may not be familiar with. So if you think of a classroom, there's lots of sources of diversity. In any one classroom, you'll have a whole range of different students with different strengths and challenges. There are 2 major types of challenges if you think of youngsters in a classroom. One is their inherited abilities for learning. We call them the biological sources. And the other is a psychosocial environment. And so these kind of admixtures can assist or impede a child's progression in a particular class. When we're looking at biological, we're talking about things like these neurodevelopmental disorders. So if you've got language problems or learning disabilities or ADHD, it itself will make it more challenging for learning in a regular classroom if the teacher doesn't understand and adjust the instruction slightly or adjust the environment. The other, though, is the other thing to keep in mind is ADHD is not a categorical entity, really. You might receive a diagnosis, but it's not that you either have it or don't have it. And that's a critical thing. It's not like chickenpox or measles that you either have or you don't have, or pregnancy, you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. It's actually more the issue of a dimension that if you think of the last week even, or the last few days, I bet you all have had some struggles with being inattentive, say, what did you say? Or fidgety. And if you have to sit too long, I'm sure many of you will start getting fidgety, or impulsive because you've got so much on, you kind of, you just get frustrated and burst out something or make some comment or do something just because the frustration in the moment. So these traits are present in all of us, but to different degrees. And the best analogy is blood pressure, where if you have 2 aspects of blood pressure, systolic and diastolic, and we know when the doctor measures you, everybody's blood pressure throughout the day will go up and down. And it's only when either systolic and or diastolic start to be elevated most times, and whenever the doctor's measuring it, and they usually do repeated measurements, it's elevated. And then at some point, what they've done is make a cutoff, and they've changed that cutoff, the medical system, over the years, and they've now focused not just on systolic, but they focus on diastolic, both of them. So when it becomes elevated most of the time, they say categorically you now have hypertension. You've got high blood pressure. And so then they'll start treatment because they know that at a certain level, if it's persistent, it gives risk for later other medical problems. So that's when they say you need treatment, intervention. But in reality, of course, it's a continuum. But this is exactly the same as ADHD. So here, as I say, if it's over nowadays, I think it's still 130 over 90, you might start treatment. Or they recommend you alter your lifestyle. There's an intervention of some sort. So similarly, when we're measuring things like inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity, if we actually looked at a sort of distribution of scores, most people are going to be at this 50th percentile, roughly, so fall between, so, oopsie, let's find here. There's my cursor. They'll fall between these 2 points in terms of inattention and or hyperactivity. But if you're above that, if you're more inattentive than most people, for most of the time, and it continues for at least 6 months, or more hyperactive impulsive than most people of your age and gender, then you're going to maybe have a diagnosis of ADHD, taking everything else into account. But keep in mind those cutoffs are somewhat arbitrary. Okay. ADHD is also a paradox at the surface level. If you're a parent with or a spouse with somebody with ADHD, or a teacher, it's really frustrating. Because on the one hand, what really hits you right in the eyes is the excessive behavior. So excessive movement, high activity level that's inappropriate for the context, excessive talk, so talking when you're not supposed to talk, and you have to pluck the vocal cords when you want them to talk. Excessive demands, cannot wait, want it now, instantly, constant interrupting. So that's what really grabs your attention. However, the other thing is insufficient behavior. So you can see these excesses and insufficiencies. So the insufficient behavior is things like inadequate focus and concentration, highly distractible, inability to focus on hand. But sometimes they overfocus and you can't get an individual to shift. So this is why, again, it's really subtle, and the sort of inconsistency often can't adjust to the context. So inadequate task engagement or re-engagement. Procrastination is interesting. Yes, putting off things to the last minute, well, we often do this ourselves. But the difference we're finding is that particularly when you're talking to adolescents and college and university students or adults with ADHD who have got the language now to be able to explain to you what happens about this putting off, procrastinating, it's a sense of being overwhelmed, of not being able to start, of anxiety increasing. And therefore, they're trying really to comply and meet a deadline, but they've left it too late, not because they're truly lazy or just don't care at all. They do care intensely, but they just don't know how to start. So it becomes so overwhelming that they're going to miss deadlines. And this is what's heartbreaking. It's not an intentional procrastination. It's a sense of being overwhelmed, anxious, worried, etc. So it's a very different scenario. Inadequate organization and memory for sequencing, and particular time management, is really challenging. If you've got a good manager, you'll get by well. But if it's up to you to keep organizing, that effort is so exhausting. It can't be consistently organized. So look at this picture. You know, the majority of swimming fish are one way, and this one person with high symptoms of ADHD is going the other way. It is not the case that challenging behavior is intentional. This fish with ADHD is not intentionally going against your instructions or wishes. They're not intentionally misbehaving. It's a case that they simply can't self-regulate consistently. If they tried, it's so exhausting that they soon run out of ability to self-regulate, so you'll suddenly see an eruption of symptoms. So it's not intentional behavior. And I think this is absolutely key. It can be annoying, nobody's denying that. And of course, any individual at some times might be intentional, but in general, it's not an intentional problem with a behavioral issue. Because why we know this is that the symptoms of ADHD are context dependent, totally varied across the demands and the type of context. So you get elevated rates of fidgetiness, restlessness, out-of-seat behavior if there's a lot of long periods of high cognitive demands with low stimulation. So if you think of much schoolwork, especially once you get into the kind of grade 4 and upwards, you've got to sit in your seat, you've got to listen, you've got to do these endless things again and again. And in adults, you have to do this repetitive work in the office. That's when you might see, because the demands are high, but it's not very stimulating. And so that's when you see elevated restlessness. By contrast, you get reduced hyperactivity when there's high stimulation and low cognitive demand. Think of now, I don't know if any of you have got youngsters playing video games, or on their gizmos, as I call it. They appear, when playing video games, which they'll play for a long time, to be almost like, quote, without ADHD, because they sit still and they play for hours. But in reality, when we study that, they're not. They still are more restless than their peers if we assess them in the same situation with the same knowledge and experience level of video games. And if they're playing video games that are challenging, so not just simple zap, zap, zap games, but if you actually watch the youngsters playing what I call problem-solving games, such as having to negotiate challenges, the chasms and things coming at you. If it's one challenge, they're fine, they'll manage. If there's more of the challenges in a row, they can't manage and the character dies. It's really tough because this is their preferred activity often, but they're still not as good as their peers. But it does change in that context of where it's high stimulation. We also know that this notion of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity have very different developmental outcomes. Inattention, in the preschool years, often is associated with poor language abilities that actually seems to predict or exacerbate problems with attention. And then subsequently, not surprisingly, you get problems in learning to read and write and do math, poor social skills. Sadly, without support and treatment, and understandably, because we're talking about individuals who are bright, if you have a trajectory like that, it's no wonder they feel depressed by the time they get to an adulthood, because they're just not functioning at the level they know they're really able to. By contrast, the impulsivity, hyperactivity tends to be associated early on with problems with peers, establishing and keeping and maintaining friendships. Often co-occurs with non-compliant behavior, the oppositional behavior. It's very rare, but there are some individuals who are predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, who don't really show much inattention problems. And when we look at their academics, it's okay. They might be truant from school, but they're not losing ground. That group tend to have more problems with sort of relationships in general, and might be towards substance abuse. I always worry when I show this type of outcome because remember this is based on groups of individuals, not individuals. So you can't predict where a student or a child or family member is going to go in a developmental trajectory. Could be very successful with support. But they do, again, as I want to re-emphasize, inattention is the strongest predictor of impairments in learning and applying knowledge. Even once you control for specific learning disabilities, the symptoms of ADHD in themselves are causing problems. Hyperactivity and impulsivity is the strongest predictor of classroom disruption. Well, it's not surprising because it's right in your face. And oppositional behavior, it's the oppositional behavior that tends to go towards a really negative trajectory if you've got those problems as well. But just as in this magical creature, this is for a lovely sort of display currently in Ontario at the museum there of Islamic art, is that this creature, we could say, okay, it is an X. Superficially, it looks like an X, and like we say, this youngster has ADHD. But inside, they're not all the same. they've got different bits and bobs and parts that makes every child or every individual with ADHD often a bit quite markedly different from another person with ADHD. There's not a consistent profile, so it's quite a mixture. ADHD, how it shows up, the strengths and limitations vary from person to person. So your child with ADHD might be so different to your child with ADHD. So very, very different. Moreover, if that's not enough, ADHD is this categorical entity, this diagnosis that is given, it co-occurs with just about everything in the DSM. And even if it's not at the level of diagnosis, it co-occurs with lots of symptoms of all these things, of writing problems and learning disabilities and even autism spectrum disorder and so on. These neurodevelopmental disorders all overlap with each other. So it's no wonder Charlie Brown says, good grief, what bit is ADHD? What bit of this peculiar animal with all these co-occurring problems, which bit of this animal is ADHD? And that's why it's very challenging to understand what ADHD is, because it's so variable. The disability side, you probably have heard so many times. It's a very, very worrying storyline. Here I've just presented it as simply as possible, saying if ADHD is not recognised and not treated, not supported, the outcome is not good for most individuals. So it starts in childhood, where there might be unintentional injuries, burns, broken bones, etc., because a child suddenly runs out in streets, pulls something without thinking. You see academic underachievement, you see problems with friendships, going on through adolescence, where what I call unhealthy lifestyles and unhealthy decision-making occurs, so early smoking onset. ADHD doesn't disappear when you get behind a car, behind a driving wheel. So the rates of driving accidents are higher in ADHD than those without ADHD in the absence of any support or treatment. And then, of course, if you didn't do well in school and you didn't get your school certificates, you're not so attractive to the workforce. And if you're not so attractive to the workforce, life tends to fall apart a bit and relationships continue to problem. But that's what I call the depressing story, and it doesn't have to be that way. What is very important is to keep in mind that the child, the adolescent, the adult with ADHD is first a person. Their particular challenges come with that person. They're not are that person. And again, just take a second or two to think 5 positive things about the person with ADHD that you know, whether it's a child, a student, a spouse. Write down 5 positive things about that person. And this is basically, particularly if for those of you who are in this work in the school system, it's absolutely paramount to first get to know your student, get to know who they are, what they like, etc. What are the positive things? Because for my training, we were always trained to identify the strengths and then use those strengths to help address the challenges. So if you don't know the strengths, you can't capitalize on them. So it will help an individual with ADHD more if we know their strengths first than if we just list all the challenges. So interestingly, when Heidi and I were working on this sort of study, there's a multi-stage study trying to look at a way of measuring the abilities and impairments of ADHD, I got more and more devastated because of all the different stages. All we got was hundreds, thousands of limitations and challenges. I kept saying, but wait a minute, we're supposed to be looking at abilities and as well as disabilities. And eventually, when sort of pushed and probed, then all of these 174 experts of all different professions across 11 disciplines, 45 countries, listed again, and this is what I call their unified list of what the positives are. It's just having a shift in mindset. Creativity, energetic, exciting and fun to be around, flexible, interesting views on things, multitasking, switch from one thing to another. We're not talking about the outcome whether that's necessarily good. But resilience. I think you've got to understand that given the, I call it the public perspective and so on of ADHD, which is often a very negative one, is that these kids, every single day of their life, they may have had challenges in the family at home. They've gotten told off, they didn't get themselves together, they missed the school bus, they're late for this, they forgot this. And then when they get to school, they seem to be in trouble. And then their friends don't like them very much. They don't make friends, keep friends. If you think they're facing this every single day, and these problems have been starting right from early on in the preschool years, they are resilient because they keep coming back. Maybe they don't have a chance, but they're not all suddenly becoming, resistant to go to school. They might not like school, but they turn up and they still try, and they're willing to try. It's just that they can't keep it going. So again, they are incredibly resilient, and we can capitalize on that to help these youngsters. And yes, they're risk takers, which has its downside, but they are risk takers, which can be a good side. If we can engage and challenge, they'll try it out, a different approach. So keep in mind that notion. Also, ADHD itself, this diagnosis, does not set limits. Who said this? The pool is a safe haven, 2 walls at either end, lane lines on both sides, and a black stripe on the bottom for direction. Who's that? Yeah, absolutely. So the most decorated Olympian, who we know over these years has had their ups and downs and challenges, think of this guy's abilities. Yet, he was diagnosed with ADHD at age 9, and a teacher told his mother, "Your son will never be able to focus on anything." His grades were B's, C's, and a few D's. A death knell sentence for a parent to receive. And yet, think of what he's attained. He might not be the top, brightest, university graduate, but think his incredible persistence, resilience, and coming back into the swimming field and challenging. It's amazing. He's had an incredibly supportive family, absolutely. But, we've known he's got into trouble too. But it doesn't matter, he comes back. And that's what we have to keep in mind. It takes a lot more effort from both the individual with ADHD and the supporters, the team, the family team, the community team, the school team. So a few things to keep in mind. Factors that don't cause ADHD: poor parenting, family problems, poor teachers, ineffective schools, too much television, too much sugar, food allergies, diet in general. None of these alone will cause ADHD, but they might make life very much more difficult and contribute to the problems of individuals with ADHD. So let me just continue on, and promise you won't show you umpteen brain things that you don't quite know which is right and left of the brain, but I think there are important things to keep in mind for working and supporting an individual with ADHD. One, that it's a highly genetic condition. If we look at twin studies, do you know what, when we talk about heritability, the numbers go from basically 0 to 1. Height, the sort of heritability of height is 0.9, very high. What's the heritability of ADHD? 1. Very close, it's 0.7. Heritability of things like reading disorder, dyslexia, is about 0.5, about 0.5. ADHD is incredibly heritable. So most of the kind of variation is due to genetic factors. Not everything, but a lot of it. So it runs in families. So it's not surprising. Many times, parents will bring their child to a clinic, often because they're worried. They know something's going on, but mostly because the school's told them something's going on, or because the teacher has said they have to go to get some support for this child. Whatever. And it's not surprising that in our clinic at Hospital for Sick Children, so many mothers and fathers self-recognized as having ADHD at that point. Because as they went through the diagnostic interview and asked about, during the day, during the week, what the kind of challenges they had, so often a mother or father might say, yeah, it's kind of like me. but they never received a diagnosis. They just know they've struggled all their lives. And so it does run in families. So a child with ADHD often has a parent, at least one parent, and or a sibling with ADHD. Keep in mind that if the parent has ADHD, or there are more than one sibling with ADHD, it is really going to add to the challenge of parenting. Parenting these days is way more complex than, I look at my children parenting my grandchildren, and they are facing challenges that we never faced in our time. It's become more complex to parent these days. But if you've got one parent with ADHD, as I say, or more than one family member with ADHD, it's just going to add to the challenges of parenting. So don't blame parents. Environmental factors, you've got to remember that many youngsters, if we probe, have had a lot of exposure to what we call stresses early on. So it could be things like mothers might have taken alcohol in pregnancy or smoked in pregnancy. They could have been exposed to pesticides that are all around us. All the things of the kind of plastic stuff that's going on, all of these things in our environment now, sadly, we know are probably not good for a developing fetus. So there's lots of sort of toxins in the environment, none of which, so if you smoked in pregnancy or you drank a glass of wine or beer, it's not that you doesn't necessarily cause ADHD, but it's the risk factor. So think about it, if you've got a genetic risk in the family for ADHD, and you add these additional problems, or the child has something like premature birth, born with very low birth weight, it's not a guarantee, but it's just going to increase the risk of the youngster developing ADHD. So there's not one causal factor. The other thing we know is, and this is why, because of all these contributing factors, is probably why there is so much diversity within ADHD. It depends on the timing of these challenges to the developing fetus. What is quite fascinating is the marked brain differences that can be discerned at age 6 to 8 years of old. Often this is preceding a formal diagnosis. But if they study, this is about over 600 children, this is a study from the Netherlands, where they followed these youngsters over time. And at age 6, they had a structural sort of picture, like an X-ray of their brain. And the sample was a bit reduced because kids fidget in these scans. But in general, what they find is quite intriguing, that these 6 to 8-year-olds, who are known then to have ADHD, had what they called a thinner part in this blue area, which is the sensory motor cortex. My cursor there. There it is. These blue areas are really sort of the sensory areas, primary somatosensory cortex. That's not actually really has not been highlighted in the field of ADHD. Everybody's focusing on, it's something to do with the front part of the brain. That's to do with higher reasoning functioning. But this is a basic sensory area, and the significance of the thinner cortex means that it's less mature. Really interesting that that's come up for several reasons. Without going on into great depth, sensory motor perception, if you think of a baby, sensory motor perception is so critical in those early months of development. It's absolutely essential for the rooting and sucking reflex. So it might alter the mother-child interaction because this baby is maybe not as good at nursing and taking milk as another child. And that would obviously would alter that mother-child interaction. All of these early years, children use sensory motor input. Think of all the mouthing that goes on, picking up objects that drive parents crazy because of safety issues. But all of that is a way of learning. So these sensory motor areas are absolutely critical. The sense of touch, sensing, moving, is so critical for learning. And it influences these early months and years, influence the whole development of motor, social, and communication skills. So we know that these mother-child patterns are very critical also for the sort of success and easiness of parenting. They don't causal, but they contribute. And obviously father-child, but it's just less known about father-child interaction with ADHD. I was fascinated when this study came out because we studied it at the Hospital for Sick Children. I call it real-time functioning of the brain in these young adults with ADHD. And we had this puzzling finding that we weren't sure how to understand. So what we did is this particular type of imaging technique, without going into detail, but if you present some kind of stimulus, in this case we just did a little electrical pulse right on the surface of the skin at your wrist. So no cognition involved, no thinking, and we just presented that. And what we're able to do is we demonstrate within 20 milliseconds, we can see how the brain reacts. It's magical. And these pretty pictures, and what we did as we're scientists, is that sometimes we presented these little electrical pulses regularly, predictably like this. Sometimes we presented them so they would come predictably and then suddenly stop. We didn't ask the adults to do anything, just except be there. When we looked at their brain, a huge difference in terms of when we looked at these pretty colours, that this red blobs here are when we did the little electrical stimulus. This blue blob here, this is in an adult without ADHD. This blue blob indicates, this is on the unpredictable, indicates, their brain processed there was something different. It happened, there was some prediction that, it didn't happen. And it was marked by that person's brain. ADHD, not there. So this is really puzzling. It's as though, again, something in these automatic sensory processing was altered. We're still pursuing it. We don't quite understand it, but marked differences, but not in the predictable. So when everything's going on fine, it's okay. But when there's a sudden change, their brain didn't register it. So maybe they have to do things more effortfully because they can't rely on automatic functioning. Much of our day, much of our life, we actually are on automatic. We don't heavily process everything. That's only a very small proportion of the day. And it looks as though for these individuals, they might have to do a lot more effortful processing than other people, which is perhaps why individuals with ADHD, kids with ADHD, adults tell us they're tired. It's exhausting. It's so much work, and they just get so frustrated because they can't keep it going. This has been a finding that's been known for a long, long time. This was a study from the NIH, a longitudinal study, where again they measured what I call X-rays of the brain repeatedly, and they could look at how the brain develops in ADHD. And what they found was that the darker the blue is the sort of areas where it takes longer to mature. And so what they're saying is that there might be a 2 to 3 year difference between the chronological age and the individual's or a child's ability to self-regulate their attention, their behavior, and emotion. So it's a delay issue, and it doesn't clearly indicate what I call a difference. It just seems to be delayed maturation. So we may have like mismatches between different parts of the brain. Some parts of the brain mature at the same rate as in their peers, but other parts, what we call particularly the parts that have to put on the brake, might not. So that it's like an uneven development, which again is making it hard and may partly explain what I call this risk-taking, unpredictable, impulsive behavior. We don't know. So these neurobiological differences understandably would give rise to a whole range of neurodevelopmental problems that were going to occur and be shown in the preschool years and typically persist through to adulthood, with the ability to compensate and to manage given support and treatment. So this is really what the challenge is for thinking of youngsters at school or at university or adults in the workplace who have ADHD, that they don't look any different from anybody else, but they behave differently. They perform more poorly in class. Even in the workplace, it's this notion, there's a lovely word being used called absenteeism. Presenteeism, absenteeism in the workplace is because these adults with ADHD often have to go and see doctors, medical treatment, and but they also have a lot of more health problems, or they just need to take, quote, a mental health day. Presenteeism is when they actually are present at work, but it's just too demanding, can't keep it going, and they have to pull out. So they're physically there, but mentally not there. And I remember this description that my sister gave me of working, she's in Hollywood in the film industry, where there's a surprising number of directors and stunning camera crew who have ADHD. They found their niche. Brilliant. Many of the directors that you would know, I suspect, by name anyway. But what she described is being in a meeting, a very high-powered meeting, billions of dollars being discussed about a film, and this brilliant young intern who would come to do film studies and be trained working with one of these top-notch directors. And as part of his internship, he was required to take notes of the meeting. So my sister, who's a kind of higher up level, after the meeting, called him and said, okay, how quickly can you type up those notes and get them to me? We need them in about 2 hours. And there was this, well, Frances, which is my sister, said, as you know, I was at the meeting, and I wasn't eating. I didn't take any coffee or, or donuts or anything like that. And I kind of got words down. And she says, She says, do you have the notes? She says, well, not exactly. And he got words because he could not listen. He kept what I call tuning out. It was too much. There was so much going on. He couldn't stand back and get the notes done. And this is classic. It's not just in Hollywood. It occurs in high school, in colleges, universities, and in the workplace. It's just so much effort to keep that going. So they're really saying these young individuals don't respond, can't respond because of their problems to typical classroom management. They can respond sometimes, and that's why the blame gets put. You did it yesterday. You're just not listening. You're lazy. You're not motivated. Oh, it's a parent's problem. They should discipline this kid more. So these are the kind of charges that are given about an individual with ADHD. And they really do have these hidden learning problems, and they're hidden multiple ways. They're hidden as like a learning disability, like dyslexia, but they're hidden even more so because of all the observable behavior that goes on that grabs people's attention. So anything is attributed to ADHD, even though it's, in addition, they have learning problems. So we always say ADHD more than meets the eye. Yes, you've got these behavioral excesses and behavioral insufficiencies above the sea level. That's the kind of top tip of the iceberg. Below, there are going to be, in the majority of individuals with ADHD, some academic and or social difficulties that affect learning and performance. Of course, what's contributing that are these really deep hidden brain differences in ADHD, in the structure, the way it functions, etc. And they have an impact on how this individual can process information in everyday life, in everyday performance. And underneath that, of course, are some of these biological issues and environmental issues that start the whole kind of cascade going. So the key points here are that the emerging concept of ADHD is really one of delayed brain maturation, perhaps as much as in some parts of the brain, it could be up to 3 years, of impaired, which results in impaired self-regulation of attention, behavior, emotion, and learning. So that is why this is such a complex picture. So again, key points, it's prevalent, it's very mixed, it's really hard to find a commonality in some ways. Think of the outline of that animal, some kind of ibex, deer, but keep your mind on all the differences inside it. That's the challenge with ADHD. Because it's not a discrete disorder that you have or don't have, there are going to be at least 1 to 2 students in every classroom with a diagnosis of ADHD or a level of impairment that is diagnosable, but there's also going to be kids who may have 4 or 5 symptoms of inattention, 4 or 5 symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity, and those too are going to cause problems. It is a dimension. So, but keep in mind, so much of the stories of ADHD, the work on ADHD is all negative. It's deficit. I hate this name. It's a deficit disorder. And what it's not emphasizing is I'm not saying that it's a gift. I'm saying that every individual has strengths, and so do individuals with ADHD. And so it's a positive characteristics as well. We need to highlight, focus, and really encourage. The symptoms and impairment will likely persist from preschool to secondary school and beyond. No biological markers at this point. There's no test, blood test, X-ray, genetic test that can be done to rule in or rule out a diagnosis of ADHD. It still remains clinical diagnosis, which in part gives rise to the ongoing challenges. It's a myth. It's overdiagnosed. Everybody has ADHD these days, but it's also underdiagnosed, particularly in girls and in women. So it's a challenge. We don't know the cause, but there's multifactorial causes, and genetics play a major role, and so do what we call environmental adversities that occur. So I'm going to stop because we need to take a break, I think at 10:20. I think I'm right. Yep. So let's have an opening up for questions. Things you're puzzled about, things you don't understand. Yes, this person.
My daughter with ADHD has also been diagnosed with sensory processing
Okay.
disorder, which I have really struggled because it looks very much to me like what I hear about ADHD, and I'm very curious your thoughts on that.
Sure. So the question was, one of the participants here has a daughter has received a diagnosis of ADHD or looks like ADHD, but has a central auditory processing, a diagnosis of central auditory processing disorder, as well as. Okay. So this is one of these complications, and I have to, first of all, I have great empathy because some of the children that leave our clinic are like a walking DSM. They've got ADHD, central auditory processing, they've got oppositional, they've got anxiety, they've got learning disabilities. It's like, this little, gorgeous little boy has all of these things? How could this be? And that's why, again, the notion of central auditory processing disorder is accepted and vehemently defended by some professionals and not by others. It was not recognised in the DSM, therefore it doesn't appear in the DSM, because the argument was there wasn't sufficient evidence. It itself was a discrete category, disorder. Rather, that individuals with ADHD, individuals with language impairments, the problems that she'd be having with listening to sounds, etc., would be very similar to those associated with ADHD and language problems. So it's like people who specialize in this type of problem of processing auditory information, spoken language, etc. It's as though they're looking at just this bit of the elephant. And somebody in psychiatry or psychology who doesn't really know much about the language maybe looks at this side of the elephant. And so we don't really know. It's just something to keep in mind that we know a lot about ADHD. We know less about central auditory processing disorder simply because it hasn't been substantiated by enough people over enough years to get a solid research base. However, what it's telling you is that your daughter may well have problems within a classroom or at home because spoken language is so fast that she might only get a bit of it. So if she's not following what you ask her to do, it may be because she didn't hear it, understand it, rather than she's defying you. In school, because classrooms are often noisy, you've got lots of shuffling and noises going on, and lots of language. The teacher might be using a lot of language, a lot of concept, a lot of complex language, special terms that are math, arithmetic terms, other terms that are to do with subjects. And it may be very confusing because just the processing of spoken language. So some of the sounds within the spoken language might not be as distinct. I don't know, obviously, the individual profile of your daughter, but to me, I would be concerned more than the diagnostic labels, but rather with what is the likely challenges and what can she do well. In certain situations, I bet you she processes sound very well, like anybody else. But at certain conditions, when it's noisy, simultaneous talk, conversations, might be more difficult for her. Okay. Other questions in the red here in the middle.
There's always the thought that the children can outgrow mental deficit. Do you believe that, or is it just people get better at coping?
Right. So the question was, and comment is, it's often believed that individuals with ADHD outgrow the disorder. Is that the case, or is it the case that they just get better compensating? Both is most likely the case. That indeed there is evidence that there are individuals by whom, by sort of late adolescence, early adulthood, the symptoms really diminish. So they no longer would meet the diagnosis of ADHD. If we measure impairment, that persists. So on one hand, you've got the symptoms decreasing, so they're no longer bouncing around, etc. But the impairments, because if you think of the years that was actually struggling, you'll still have ongoing impairments that typically can go on to the adult years. Yes, there are a small subset where it seems to totally remit, totally go away. But obviously, as you get older, first of all, once you leave school, you can make your own choices. You don't have to sit in a classroom or do a job that requires the kind of conditions. You don't have to do the pace of learning that's required. You can make decisions, and we have I can think of many psychologists and physicians who are as ADHD as you come. But they've got very efficient secretaries, personal assistants, very tolerant spouses, supportive spouses, functioning incredibly, very well, and actually what I call have great empathy and understanding of ADHD. So it's all those cases, really. But sometimes I say what's the challenge is the diagnosis. They no longer meet the criteria for a diagnosis, the service is pulled. But the impairments continue, which is really challenging for that individual. Okay. Yes, over here in the green.
I was concerned about the greater propensity of people with ADHD becoming, developing addiction or depression. I'm just wondering if that is, you mentioned something about lack of success and throughout, and that may lead to it. I'm just wondering if there's more to it than that.
Sure. So the participant was saying there's concern about what I presented on really ADHD being a risk factor for subsequent depression, for substance abuse, and so on. Is there something we can do about it? Is it a separate thing from ADHD? We don't really know. What we know clinically is that young people who are referred to clinics are often going to be more severe and more complex than individuals who actually have ADHD but never get referred. But individuals who are referred to clinics, in childhood, we do see childhood depression. However, in childhood, it might manifest as really marked irritability, not in a way that adults manifest depression. So it might be that things are being missed or miscalled. So a youngster who's really cranky and irritable and lashes out, perhaps due to depression early on, may be missed, and it's all attributed to ADHD and oppositional behavior or whatever. And it might actually be, beginnings of depression then. So when they manifest later as depression, it would be a continuous development. We don't know, but mostly, if you think individuals with ADHD, so much of the time in reality are functioning well. It's just that in certain contexts and demands, they go down. So if you're an individual, think about it. On the one hand, you know what you know, and you don't understand why you can't keep doing it. And if you're a thinking, sensitive, reflective person, you're going to get worried. You're going to get initially just down. That might, if you don't get any help or support, might later manifest as full-blown depression. We don't know the trajectories clearly. As I say, I hold some of these questions because Penny, who is much closer to the clinical field still than I am at this age, I've kind of stepped a little bit away from the clinic, may be able to provide more insights onto that, on the kind of trajectories. But as I say, it's rare to find somebody with just ADHD through the lifespan. Don't forget, the term ADHD is the generic term. It could be what used to be called just ADD, or just hyperactivity, possibly, or the full thing. So though it's the kind of manifestations, it's a complex issue and we don't know fully, but impairment, even though the symptoms might be better managed, it continues. Even under the best treatment, for example, we have robust evidence that pharmacological treatment is very helpful for a large portion of individuals with ADHD for a short time in terms of suppressing the behavioral symptoms. Does it actually get to some of the underlying things? There's not so much evidence, very minimal evidence. So that's why intervention support for ADHD truly has to be multimodal, ongoing, because there is no one treatment that, quote, fixes ADHD beyond, once we look beyond 6 months, our evidence for longer term effects, even of the best studied medication, is not strong. So we don't know over the long term what this does. What we do know is that studies of, there's been longitudinal studies of adults, so following them from childhood through to adulthood, who've been treated with medication. I think we can now say with pretty good confidence that it does not, the use of medication does not increase substance abuse. So it's not kind of predisposing the young adolescent or adult to later substance abuse. Some would argue it might protect against that, but that evidence is not as robust. Okay. We probably have time for one more question and then we have to stop. Any urgent? Yep, at the back, right at the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering, there was a slide here about the delayed brain growth.
Right.
And up to 3 years delay structurally. Does that catch up at some point?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you for asking that. So I've been using the word as delay. So in terms of the brain development compared to typically developing individuals without ADHD, the pattern of difference, so it's just parts of the brain, seem to be not as mature at the same age, same stage. It seems to mature a bit later. Whether it's a catch-up is absolutely unknown. The suggestion is no. If we look at adults with ADHD, there are still clearly some brain differences. So the issue is it what we call a deviance, a total difference, or is it just a delay? And it's probably all of that. We just don't know the sufficient details yet. But you can still study adults with ADHD and you will still detect brain differences. So it's not necessarily a catch-up point. The brain continues to grow, often the same trajectories, but they just might always be slightly different, like in size or structure, but we really don't understand the full meaning of that for each individual, only at the group level. Okay, if you've got other questions, write them down so you don't forget, and we'll take a break, and then I can take questions before we start the next part.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to have a brief break, but really quickly before you go out there, I'd just like to put in a bit of a plug for CADDAC membership. We are a national not-for-profit. We do not receive any funding from the government. We've made a choice not to go that way at this point because we do not want any of our advocacy efforts hampered. If you've been on our website, if you like what we do, our advocacy work, our awareness work, I don't know how many you know, we're just coming off a National ADHD Awareness Month in the month of October. One of the ways that we are able to sustain ourselves is through membership. Juanita out at the desk has got membership forms. There's benefits. You receive 10% of any educational sessions. We are now running webinars that are free to attend. For members, there is a newsletter that goes out as well as email blasts to membership about updates, and there's a lot of other things as well. You can read the information out there.